Hello everyone. Tonight we're stepping into the Arctic, where hunting didn't mean sport. It meant you freezing quietly for hours while staring at a hole in the ice, hoping dinner popped up for air. We'll talk about harpoons tied to inflatable seal bladders, intestines sewn into raincoats, and whale hunts where your entire survival depended on not capsizing in a boat made of animal skins. If you like wandering into these strange corners of human history with me, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of thing. No pressure. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing this little circle stretch across the world. Now, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights, let a kettle hum in the background, and settle in because it's time to step onto the ice, where survival was always just one breath away. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Forget gym memberships, vegan burgers, or the idea of hunting as some overpriced safari weekend for men who collect watches. If you'd been born into the Arctic, you wouldn't hunt for trophies. You'd hunt because your stomach and the stomachs of 30 other people were waiting. Out here, the word hobby doesn't exist. It's meat, fat, skin, bone, or death. And death tends to win if you don't pay attention. You wouldn't get to choose your prey like it's a menu. The Arctic decides that for you. Seals, whales, caribou, fish. Each season brings its own fragile opportunity, and if you miss it, there's no, we'll just grab a pizza later. You'd eat leather, old sinew, or nothing at all. And trust me, boiled sealskin doesn't exactly taste like Michelin stars. The whole setup is both poetic and cruel. In a world where temperatures dip lower than your freezer, every living thing becomes a potential supermarket aisle. Seal fat isn't just food. It's the oil in your lamps, the heat in your bones, the very reason you don't wake up frozen solid. Whales aren't majestic animals you watch from a cruise deck. They're floating pantries that, if brought down, feed families for months and turn an entire shoreline into a butchery. Even caribou, with their dreamy migrations, aren't wildlife documentaries. They're mobile warehouses of hide, sinew, and meat that vanish as quickly as they appear. You'd be raised on the understanding that every animal carried more than calories. The seal gave light, the whale gave roofs, the caribou clothed your children, and you gave back nothing but reverence and the occasional prayer whispered over a bone. A transaction, not a conquest. You'd never see an Inuit carving antlers into a chandelier for their living room. That kind of waste was suicide. And before you imagine it as noble and cinematic, you standing on the ice with a harpoon glistening against the horizon. Let me ruin the fantasy. Hunting was exhausting. Hours of waiting in silence, snow in your eyelashes, joints stiff, the cold creeping in like a debt collector. If you twitched at the wrong second, the seal never resurfaced. If your boat crew missed the timing, the whale dove, and you wasted a week's work. Hunting wasn't glory, it was repetition, patience, and the gnawing fear that your children would go hungry because you sneezed at the wrong moment. Still, every kill was more than sustenance. It was continuity. The moment a seal's breath froze in the air above its hole, you weren't just feeding yourself. You were weaving another stitch into a fragile web of survival that stretched back generations. Failed too many times, and the web snapped. And so, when you pulled back that harpoon or cut into thick blubber, you weren't cheering. You were relieved, hungry, maybe quietly grateful. Always aware that next time, the ice might not hold, the whale might vanish, or the caribou might migrate elsewhere. And then you'd need more than luck. You'd need knowledge. Because out here, survival wasn't about hunting an animal. It was about reading a world of shifting ice and seasons that showed no mercy. And that brings us straight into the next question you'll face. How on earth did people know when to hunt, where to stand, and what to trust when the entire Arctic looked like an endless white joke played by the gods? So, you've just learned that hunting here isn't optional, it's survival. But here's the kicker. It's not enough to know how to hunt. You've got to know when. And in the Arctic, when is a sadistic riddle disguised as a calendar. Forget your neat wall planners and daylight savings. Up here, you don't measure time by dates. You measure it by migrations, cracks in the ice, and a brief appearance of sunlight that feels like an apology from the universe. Imagine waking up and asking, not what's for breakfast, but which animals haven't abandoned us yet. In winter, you'd stalk seals at their breathing holes, your breath freezing before it left your lips. In spring, the ice loosens, and suddenly whales pass by like floating cities. each one a potential community feast if you have the courage and the boats to chase it. Summer draws the caribou, crossing rivers in thundering herds that make your whole body itch with urgency. Miss them, and you'll spend the dark months sewing together scraps of old hide just to keep your children warm. And let's not romanticize the seasons here. This isn't spring blossoms and cozy autumn. The Arctic has two moods, frozen darkness and blinding daylight. You either stumble through months of night, guided by memory and stars, or squint endlessly under a sun that never sets, trying to convince your brain it's bedtime. Seasons don't whisper their changes, they slam the door in your face. One week you're walking on solid ice, the next you're plunging into slush, wondering if anyone will remember your name after the current drags you under. This is why Inuit survival wasn't brute strength. It was timing, intuition, and a relationship with the environment so intimate it would make modern meteorologists blush. Hunters knew the exact week when seals pupped, when narwhals threaded through narrow inlets, when caribou crossed rivers swollen with meltwater. They didn't have Google weather. They had sky colors, wind smells, bird calls, and the eerie groan of ice shifting beneath their feet. Missed the signs, and you weren't just embarrassed, you were dead. And let's not forget the delicate balance of overhunting. You couldn't just go on a killing spree and hope for the best. If you stripped too much from the land one season, the next season punished you with scarcity. Inuit hunters lived with an awareness that every kill echoed into the future. You didn't just think about today's hunger. You thought about whether seals would return next year, whether caribou would alter their routes, whether the ice itself might betray you. Picture yourself standing on the shore in summer, watching the horizon for a ripple that means a beluga pod is near. Everyone around you is tense, because if they appear, it's an opportunity that won't return for months. If they don't, you tighten your belt and wait for caribou. The year unfolds like this, chance after chance, all slipping quickly away if you're not ready. And here's the irony. The Arctic may look barren, but it's bursting with life if you know when to find it. Outsiders saw desolation. Inuit saw a clock. Not a clock with hands or numbers, but one ticking with migrations, melting ice, and whispers of wind. And if you could read it, you could live. But clocks aren't much use without context. It's one thing to know the seals will be here in spring. It's another to step onto the ice and tell which patches will hold you and which ones will swallow you whole. That's where the next lesson waits, the brutal art of reading the ice. Now, let's talk about the floor under your feet, the ice. You think of it as solid, right? White, flat, dependable, like the ice cubes in your drink. Except here, in the Arctic, the ice is less of a floor and more of a moody personality test. One moment it carries you, the next it swallows you whole. Reading it is not a hobby, it's your daily insurance policy. Fail the exam, and congratulations, you've won a one-way ticket under the ice sheet, where even your dogs won't bother searching. Imagine stepping onto what looks like a frozen road, only to hear the faintest groan beneath you, like the earth itself sighing at your stupidity. Inuit hunters learned to hear those sighs, to spot hairline cracks invisible to anyone else, to notice where the wind had scoured the surface clean and left the thinner, deadlier sections exposed. You didn't just walk across the ice, you negotiated with it, tiptoeing like you were trespassing on the gods' dinner table. And the thing is, the ice isn't static. It moves, constantly. Pressure ridges form overnight, slabs shift, cracks open and close with tides. One hunter might cross safely in the morning, and by afternoon the same spot is a gaping black wound filled with freezing seawater. Outsiders always imagined the Arctic as stillness. Inuit knew it as motion, endless motion, hidden under silence. Breathing holes, aglu, weren't just places to find seals. They were warnings, fresh frost around the edge, safe enough to crouch there with your harpoon, wet edges glistening under weak sunlight. Step too close and you'll be baptized in a way you don't come back from. Hunters carried harpoons not just for animals, but to probe the ground ahead, stabbing the ice, listening to the sound, testing the thickness. Think of it as the Arctic's version of knocking on a wall to check for termites, except here the termites were death and the repair bill was your life. Even snow told stories. Drift patterns revealed where ice had cracked below. A pale shimmer, like polished glass, could mean danger. Too smooth, too thin. Experienced hunters read these signs as easily as you read street names. Children learned by walking behind their elders, watching where their feet landed, memorizing the silent language of frozen water. It wasn't mystical. It was empirical science disguised as instinct. And if you ignored it, you didn't get a second chance to argue. And here's the irony. The ice that tried to kill you was the same ice that gave you life. It held the seals' breathing holes. It bridged the way to whale hunting grounds. It carried the sleds and dogs that kept your people fed. You couldn't avoid it. You had to master it. Every creak, every crack, every gust of wind, brushing snow across the surface became a line in a book you were always reading. Miss a line, and you vanished into the margins. So picture yourself kneeling, harpoon in hand, staring into a silent hole in the ice. You wait for the faint puff of seal breath, while beneath your knees, the frozen ocean shifts and moans. Your muscles ache, your ears ring in the cold, but you don't move, because survival is patience. And patience is trust in the ice you've judged to be just thick enough to hold you. And just when you think you've mastered this frozen library, another lesson lurks in the shadows. It's not enough to balance on the ice. You've got to outwit what lives beneath it, the seals, the very heartbeat of Arctic hunting. So, you've learned to trust the ice beneath your knees. Now you've got to trust yourself not to freeze solid while you wait over a hole the size of a dinner plate. Seal hunting at breathing holes wasn't glamorous. It was the definition of slow misery disguised as skill. Imagine crouching motionless for hours, eyelashes stiff with frost, listening for the faintest theft of a seal's breath. One twitch, one cough, and that animal slides back under the ice laughing. If seals laughed, which they probably did, privately, the setup is deceptively simple. Seals need to breathe, and in winter, they carve holes in the ice to access air. Hunters found those holes, stood guard, and struck the instant a seal surfaced. Simple, yes. Easy, no. Because a seal could choose any of its network of holes, surfacing unpredictably. So you waited, and doubted your sanity. Inuit hunters called it waiting at the edge of the world, the discipline of holding still while the Arctic tested your resolve. You didn't come armed with a rifle at first. You had a harpoon tipped with bone or ivory, designed to toggle and hold once it sank into the animal. The line was sealskin, tough and flexible, coiled neatly so it didn't tangle when suddenly pulled. Every detail mattered. If your hand shook when the seal exhaled, you lost. If your harpoon failed to toggle, you lost. If you hesitated, you lost. And the loss wasn't just personal embarrassment. It meant less food, less oil, less security for your family. The irony was rich. Here you were, declared divine in patience, poised like a statue, waiting to pierce a creature that probably thought of you as just another odd lump of snow. Hunters sometimes covered themselves with white caribou hides to blend in, becoming part of the frozen scenery. You, the apex predator, reduced to camouflage cosplay, just to trick a blubbery mammal into taking a breath. And yet, the payoff was enormous. A single seal meant not just meat, but fat for the colic lamps, skins for clothing, sinew for sewing, even intestines cleaned and sewn into waterproof parkas. Every part had value. Killing a seal wasn't conquest, it was unlocking a toolkit. You didn't waste anything, because waste was equivalent to starving later. Outsiders later mocked the idea of eating seal eyes or fermenting the meat underground. But to Inuit hunters, that wasn't odd. That was efficiency. Even the act of taking the seal carried ritual weight. After the kill, hunters often offered fresh water to the seal's mouth, an acknowledgement of its gift. It wasn't sentimentalism, it was spiritual bookkeeping. Treat the animal with respect, and the spirits of the sea might send more seals your way. Treat it carelessly, and the ice might turn barren. This wasn't belief tacked on to hunting, it was hunting itself. Every action bound survival to reverence. So there you sit, harpoon steady, blood stiffening in your fingers, when the seal finally surfaces. A faint puff of air, the ghost of life in the frozen silence. You strike, the line snaps taut, and suddenly the waiting is over. Relief, exhaustion, and quiet gratitude flood in. One seal down, the community survives another stretch. But then, of course, survival is never satisfied with just enough. Seal hunting might feed you through winter, but bigger prizes awaited once the ice broke and the seas opened. Because when the horizon darkened with whales, hunting stopped being solitary patience and turned into a communal test of courage. You've crouched over the breathing hole, your seal finally speared, and now you're holding the one thing between life and death, the tools. Forget your modern obsession with titanium water bottles and multi-purpose Swiss knives. Out here, gear wasn't a lifestyle statement, it was survival equipment engineered through centuries of brutal trial and error. Drop your phone today, you crack a screen. Drop your harpoon then, you starve. Start with the harpoon, not some generic stick with a point, but a masterpiece of physics in fur and bone. It had a detachable head, often carved from ivory or antler, rigged to toggle sideways once inside the animal. Why? Because a seal or whale doesn't politely hold still after being stabbed. They twist, dive, and drag, and unless your harpoon locked inside them like a hook in reverse, you'd lose everything, including maybe your arm if you tied badly. The line was sealskin, hand-cut and softened until it could hold the thrash of a beluga without snapping. The shaft had to be light enough to throw, heavy enough to strike. Each piece was customized to the hunter's hand, as intimate as a fingerprint. Then came the float, an inflated seal bladder or sealskin buoy tied to the line. The logic was brilliant. Stab the animal, it dives, but now it's dragging a balloon behind it. Good luck disappearing into the depths while towing an inflatable anchor. Imagine the ingenuity. A seal bladder becoming both tracking device and exhaustion tool long before GPS or tranquilizer darts existed. And don't think tools stopped at harpoons. Nets made from sinew fibers, painstakingly twisted, allowed fishermen to trap fish beneath the ice. Spears tipped with bone meant quick jabs through dark water. Even snow knives, carved from bone or later steel, could build an igloo shelter in a blizzard faster than you can set up a tent with color-coded poles. What's remarkable isn't just the design, but the philosophy. Tools were built from the animals themselves. Seals provided sinew for sewing, hides for lines, bladders for floats. Whales gave bones strong enough to frame sleds. Caribou antlers shaped into points and scrapers. Every tool was proof that the Arctic wasn't conquered but negotiated with you. Took from the land, then reshaped those gifts into instruments of survival. No sporting goods shop, no instruction manuals, just inherited skill and the occasional mistake you didn't live to repeat. And here's the kicker, tools weren't only practical, they were portable culture. A boy's first harpoon was both a gift and a responsibility, carved by elders to fit his hand, teaching him that survival was carried in craftsmanship as much as courage. A poorly tied knot or a dull edge wasn't laziness, it was negligence, the kind that could drag the whole camp into hunger. Every sharpened point, every smoothed shaft, every stitched sinew carried weight beyond its size. So picture yourself now, seal meat smoking in the cold air, harpoon in hand, float bobbing nearby, and tools tucked at your belt, each one humming with the work of countless ancestors who failed, froze, or drowned so that you could succeed. And yet, as ingenious as these tools were, they were just the warm-up act. Because once the ice loosened and the sea heaved with whale spouts, your modest harpoon turned into a weapon of organized chaos, and your survival hinged not on patience, but on collective daring. So, you've mastered the harpoon, tied your knots, right? And learned not to fall asleep at a seal hole. Congratulations. But now the ocean cracks open, the ice loosens, and suddenly the horizon is dotted with plumes of breath taller than houses. Whales. Not the kind you admire from a safe deck with binoculars, but 60-ton blubber fortresses swimming past your shoreline. You're not hunting for dinner anymore. You're hunting for months of survival. And here's the terrifying math. Miss a seal, your family goes hungry tonight. Miss a whale, your entire camp stares at you with the kind of silence that feels like exile. This wasn't a solo act. Seal hunting demanded patience. Whale hunting demanded choreography. Whole crews gathered, piling into Umiak's large skin-covered boats stretched over driftwood frames. Picture a floating basket, held together by sinew and faith, pitched against an animal strong enough to flip it with a twitch of its tail. You, sitting in that boat, gripping your harpoon, weren't thinking about glory. You were thinking about how badly you didn't want to be the one who missed. And yet, people did it. They launched out, silent paddles cutting the water, hearts pounding with the rhythm of every stroke. When the whale surfaced, you had seconds. The lead harpooner struck first, embedding the toggling head deep into muscle. Then the floats came, sealskin bladders tied to the line, and suddenly the whale was tethered to a constellation of bobbing balloons. each one a drag, each one a countdown. You didn't kill a whale outright, you wore it down, exhausted it, while it dragged your boats across icy seas in a chaos of spray and screaming lungs. The risks were spectacular. Whales capsized boats, hunters drowned, ropes tangled and dragged men under in seconds. And if you think anyone got medals for bravery, think again. The reward wasn't a trophy, it was the survival of everyone you loved. A bowhead could yield tens of thousands of pounds of meat and blubber, enough to keep lamps burning and bellies full long after the hunt. The community feasted, stored, and shared. A whale wasn't one family's prize, it was a village's lifeline. Even the process of butchering was communal theatre. Men cut thick slabs of blubber, women rendered oil, children helped drag pieces inland. Every tendon, rib, and scrap was claimed for use. Sled runners, tools, rope, clothing, and beneath it all was ritual. The acknowledgement that this creature gave itself, that the sea spirits allowed it, that the people must respect it or risk famine next season. Killing a whale wasn't just a feat of strength. It was a dialogue with the universe, written in blood and salt water. Now imagine standing on the shore as the whale finally surrenders, its massive body hauled in, its life ending so your people's lives might continue. Relief floods the air, mingled with exhaustion and reverence. You're alive, the community's alive, and for a while, the Arctic feels generous. But you know the truth, generosity here is temporary, because while whale hunts filled bellies, they also demanded movement. You weren't always on the sea. Sometimes survival meant turning inland, away from whales and seals, and following herds across tundra with a different kind of challenge. And for that, you needed another set of vessels, not boats, but boats made for land. So there you are, staring at a beached whale, the size of a building, thinking, well, that was terrifying. But here's the punchline. You didn't even get close to that animal without boats stitched together out of whatever the Arctic grudgingly provided. Forget steel hulls, fiberglass, and GPS. The Inuit gave the world the kayak and the umiak, two floating paradoxes, fragile-looking skin boats that somehow carried people across seas that froze grown men in minutes. Take the kayak, sleek, silent, and tailored to one hunter like a suit. Except instead of fabric, it was stitched sealskin, stretched tight over a driftwood or whalebone frame. Driftwood, by the way, had to be scavenged from ocean currents, sometimes carried hundreds of miles by rivers in Siberia or Canada. That meant every plank was a gift from faraway forests the Inuit never saw. Nothing wasted, nothing casual. Build it wrong, and you weren't just wet, you were dead. A kayak wasn't just a boat, it was camouflage. Low on the water, it let you glide right up to seals, walrus, or even whales without being spotted. Every hunter had one customized to his body, narrow enough that if you gained a little too much blubber yourself, you risked not fitting inside. And there was no luxury seating. You slid in like a letter into an envelope, sealed tight with a waterproof jacket called a tulik. You became part of the boat. The line between human and vessel blurred, which was poetic until you capsized. Then you learned quickly whether you could perform the famous Eskimo roll, flipping upright underwater, or whether you'd become a footnote in camp gossip. But if the kayak was intimacy, the umiak was community. Imagine a giant open boat, big enough to carry whole families, supplies, and a dozen hunters. Covered in seal or walrus hide, it was the truck of the Arctic seas, ferrying people to summer camps or out on whale hunts. Women often paddled them too, guiding heavy loads through frigid waters with arms as strong as rope. They weren't fast, but they were steady, and when the entire shoreline gathered to watch the umiak's launch, you knew something enormous and risky was about to happen. These boats weren't just transport, they were survival strategies. The kayak hunted small, the umiak hunted big. Together they made the Inuit seafaring masters in a place where the sea tried daily to kill them. Outsiders marveled that skin and bone could hold against Arctic waves. Inuit just shrugged. What else would you build with? Snow. And here's the cruel humor of it all. The very animals you hunted made the boats that let you hunt them. Sealskin for waterproofing, whalebone for framing, sinew for lashings. Each successful hunt created the tools for the next, an endless loop of dependency. You weren't conquering nature, you were negotiating terms. One mistake, and the contract was voided permanently. So picture yourself kneeling in a kayak, paddle whispering through icy water, or gripping the side of a umiak as it lurches toward the spout of a whale. Your pulse is quick, your body stiff, but the boat holds. The boat always has to hold, because without it, you're not a hunter. You're just another lost body, sinking beneath the Arctic waves. And yet, boats could only take you so far. Once you returned to land, dragging sleds across snow and hauling meat over frozen tundra, you'd find that the real horsepower didn't come from your arms. It came from something with 4 legs, sharp teeth, and a habit of howling at the moon. So, you've paddled in your kayak, rowed in your umiak, and dragged whale blubber up the beach until your arms scream. Now you're back on land, staring at miles of snow that stretch like an endless insult. And here's the good news, you're not walking. The Inuit figured out long ago that the best engine in the Arctic came with fur, fangs, and a voice that howled at night like a ghost choir. Sled dogs weren't pets, they were survival machines with teeth. Picture a team of 10 to 20 dogs lashed to a sled made of driftwood and lashed bone, gliding over snow and sea ice with the speed of a car and the noise of a riot. Forget leashes and chew toys. These animals weren't curled up on your couch. They were chained outside in -40, sleeping in snowdrifts, burning calories like bonfires. Feed them poorly, and they'd remind you with growls, sharp enough to make you reconsider your life choices. Feed them well, and they'd haul not just your gear but your life across hundreds of miles of ice. And here's the brutal truth. Dogs were as expendable as they were essential. When food ran scarce, hunters sometimes had to kill the weakest animals to feed the strongest ones. A grim equation, yes, but one carved into the logic of survival. The Arctic didn't allow sentimentality. These weren't pampered Labradors with Instagram accounts. These were muscular huskies, half-wolves in some cases, who could sense a storm before you saw a cloud and would rip through harnesses just to chase a scent. The sled itself was a masterpiece of engineering disguised as simplicity. Long runners smeared with ice or moss to reduce friction, lashed together with sinew instead of nails, which would snap in the cold. Flexible joints let the sled bend without breaking as it careened over ridges and frozen pressure cracks. You didn't just ride it like a king in a carriage. You ran alongside it, shouted commands, whipped the air, and prayed the lead dog respected you enough not to steer straight into a crevasse. Commands were short, guttural sounds, not because the Inuit lacked vocabulary, but because nobody wants to yell poetry in a blizzard. A single syllable could mean turn left, speed up, or, in emergencies, stop before we all die. Dogs didn't obey like machines. They tested you, sensed weakness, and occasionally ignored you entirely if they decided the ice looked unsafe. You weren't just their master, you were their partner in a relationship built on trust, tension, and the occasional bite. But the payoff was undeniable. Dogs turned vast, hostile distances into manageable routes. They let hunters reach seal holes, haul whale blubber, transport families, and escape storms faster than human legs ever could. They were muscle, compass, alarm system, and companion rolled into one, snarling, panting package. Now picture yourself clinging to the back of a sled, dogs lunging forward, their breath steaming in the cold. The wind stings your face, the runners hum across the ice, and for a moment you feel invincible, until one dog veers left, dragging the whole team toward a patch of thin ice. And suddenly you're reminded that this engine thinks for itself. And when you finally stop, camp set, and dogs tethered, you realize something else. Land isn't just snow and silence. Beneath the ice lies another pantry, waiting to be tapped with tools that look simple, until you realize they're the difference between dinner and famine. Because when winter clamps its jaws tight, you don't chase caribou, you fish through the ice itself. So, the dogs have dragged you across a frozen wasteland, and you've managed not to fall into a crevasse or get eaten by your own lead husky. Now you stop, stomach growling, and realize the caribou won't be back for months. The seals are elusive, the whales are gone. Congratulations, you're officially desperate enough to start poking holes in ice and praying for fish. Fishing under the ice wasn't romantic. There's no serene lake, no bobbing red float, no cooler of beers beside you. There's a slab of frozen ocean, a crude hole hacked out with a bone-tipped spear, or later an ice chisel, and the kind of silence that makes you question whether anything lives down there at all. And then you remember, if nothing lives down there, you're next. The tools were ingenious in their brutality. Hooks carved from bone or ivory, baited with scraps, nets woven from sinew, lowered carefully through holes cut by painstaking effort, sometimes spears with detachable points, ready to jab the moment a shadow flickered under the ice. Imagine sitting there, half frozen, staring into black water as if it might blink back at you, hand gripping a line that could suddenly tug with the weight of salvation. And the fish did come. Arctic char, cod, sculpin. Not glamorous beasts, just solid protein with fins. Pull one up, and you'd gut it immediately. Fingers numb, blood freezing on the snow before it hit the ground. Nothing wasted. Flesh eaten fresh or dried, guts fed to dogs, bones turned into tools. A single catch meant another day of energy, another night of warmth. Fail, and you went to sleep hungrier than before, knowing tomorrow you'd try again with even less strength. But here's the eerie part. You weren't just fishing for yourself. The entire community leaned on these catches when bigger hunts failed. One man's patience with the line could tip the balance between feast and famine. Talk about pressure. Forget office deadlines. This was productivity with mortality attached. And patience wasn't optional. Hours could pass without a bite, the ice groaning beneath you, the wind gnawing your bones, while you sat still, muttering insults at a universe that seemed designed to test your endurance. Yet the rewards were more than food. Fishing holes became teaching grounds. Elders passed down techniques. Children learned to recognize the faint signs of fish movement. Women tended nets and taught how to dry or ferment catches for lean months. This wasn't solitary recreation. It was communal insurance. The kind where failure wasn't embarrassing, it was catastrophic. So imagine yourself crouched over a hole, face raw from wind, line in hand. The cold bites harder with every minute, your eyelids crusted with frost, your back aching from stillness. Then, the faintest pull, you jerk, heart hammering, and suddenly a char thrashes onto the snow, glinting silver in the pale light. Relief floods you like fire. Dinner is secured. The dogs will eat. The lamp will burn a little longer. You laugh, not because it's funny, but because it's either laugh or cry. But here's the cruel punchline. Fish, no matter how many, were only gaps. They filled stomachs, yes, but they couldn't replace the staggering wealth of fur and hide needed for clothing, shelter, and tools. For that, you had to turn inland, where herds thundered across the tundra like living rivers. And when those herds came, you didn't fish quietly. You ran, shouted, and hunted in packs. So, you've pulled a few fish from the black water, and your stomach has stopped growling like an unhappy sled dog. But protein fillets don't stitch parkas, and dried fish doesn't cover children in winter. For real survival, you needed hides, thick, warm, and endless. And that meant caribou, entire herds of them, moving across the tundra in migrations that were less a sight and more an earthquake with antlers. If seals were the heartbeat of the Arctic, caribou were the blood in its veins. Now, forget romantic images of hunters sneaking through birch forests with bows. The Arctic has no birch forests. It has tundra, endless flatland where cover is a joke, and the only thing taller than your knees is a rock. So how do you hunt animals with better noses, sharper ears, and faster legs? You don't sneak, you strategize. Inuit hunters turned patience into architecture. They built stone drive lines, long rows of cairns that funneled migrating caribou into lakes or narrow valleys where hunters waited. Imagine manipulating thousands of panicked animals with nothing but geometry, shouts, and nerve. The weapons were as ingenious as the traps. Early caribou hunters carried spears tipped with bone, or bows strung with sinew that could snap arrows through hides. Later, rifles joined the mix, but even then, strategy outweighed firepower. A single arrow in the wrong place meant days of wasted effort. A single well-placed shot meant meat for weeks, sinew for sewing, antlers for tools, hides for winter gear. Everything mattered. And here's the kicker. Caribou were more than food. They were sewing kits, tent frames, snowshoe laces, rope, bedding. The skin of newborn calves became soft inner parkas. Thick winter hides made outer coats. Sinew became thread stronger than anything you'd find in a store. Bones became needles, scrapers, and handles. You weren't killing a caribou. You were harvesting an entire survival catalog. No warranty required. But the hunt wasn't guaranteed. Herds could veer off. Storms could scatter them. Ice could block your path. Miss them, and you faced a year without new hides, which meant children shivering in rags and hunters patching boots with desperation. No herd, no future. The pressure was relentless, and so was the effort. You might spend days following tracks across landscapes that looked identical in every direction. Your legs heavy, your breath visible, your hope thinner than the ice you'd just left behind. And yet, when the moment came, when the herd thundered into a bottleneck and arrows flew, the air filled with a chaos that was part violence, part salvation. Imagine standing in the middle of a migration, animals crashing around you, hooves striking ice, hunters shouting, spears flashing, blood steaming in the cold. It wasn't sport, it was survival at its loudest, and the aftermath, work, endless work. Carcasses butchered on the spot, hides stripped, sinew cut, meat smoked or dried. The whole community joined in, hands red with effort, dogs hauling loads, children learning by watching. Nothing wasted, nothing left to rot. Because in a place where even breathing felt conditional, waste wasn't just foolish, it was suicidal. So picture yourself wiping blood from your hands, caribou hide rolled and tied, meat packed, dogs restless. You're tired, but there's relief. The camp will be warm, clothed, fed, for now. But before you relax, you're reminded of a harsher truth. It doesn't matter how much you kill or catch, if you don't use every part wisely. Because out here, survival isn't about what you take, it's about what you don't throw away. So, you've butchered your caribou, dried the meat, stitched intestine parkas, and congratulated yourself on being the most efficient human alive. But here's the catch, the Arctic isn't impressed. Efficiency doesn't guarantee tomorrow's hunt. The animals you kill aren't just meat on legs. They're beings with spirits, and those spirits are keeping score. You can't just stab a seal and walk away. You have to apologize to it first. Welcome to hunting with cosmic customer service. The Inuit understood animals as partners, not products. Seals, whales, caribou, each had a soul, a will, a memory. If you treated them with respect, their kin would return. If you disrespected them, they'd vanish. That meant offering fresh water to a seal's mouth after death, so its spirit wouldn't thirst. It meant returning bones to the sea, neatly arranged, to show gratitude. Imagine field dressing a deer today, and then carefully laying its skeleton back in place like you're tucking it into bed. That was survival etiquette. Fail at it, and your luck soured. Even tools reflected this reverence. A harpoon wasn't just a stick with a point. It was a bridge between you and the animal's will. Hunters spoke softly to their weapons, asked for their cooperation, treated them as companions rather than objects. The sea itself was alive, ruled by Sedna, the mistress of marine animals, who could open or close her hand to release seals, whales, or fish, anger her. And you weren't just unlucky, you were punished with starvation. Every hunt then became a negotiation, not with prey, but with the unseen powers holding them back. And here's the ironic twist. This wasn't superstition in the cartoon sense. It was practical theology. If you killed carelessly, you wasted resources, broke social rules, and encouraged overhunting. The spiritual framework was also ecological management, disguised as myth. Respect wasn't just piety, it was policy. When you offered water to a seal, you weren't only honoring its spirit, you were reminding your community to treat each animal as irreplaceable. Religion and resource management walked hand in hand across the ice. Picture yourself now, crouched over a seal you've just pulled from a breathing hole. The harpoon line still hums with the violence of the moment, steam rising from the fresh body. You don't cheer. You pour water gently into its mouth, whisper words of thanks, arrange its body with care. Behind you, elders watch. They don't care if you're strong or quick. They care if you remember the ritual. Because in their eyes, arrogance kills faster than hunger, and it didn't stop at seals. Whale hunts carried entire ceremonies before and after. Caribou bones were returned to rivers. Even fish were acknowledged, their remains treated carefully. Animals weren't things. They were fellow travelers on the ice, choosing whether to give themselves or not. That worldview kept hunters humble. Every time you went out, you knew the stakes weren't just physical. They were spiritual, relational, cosmic. So, while you might think of yourself as clever with tools, skilled with sled dogs, or patient at the ice hole, the truth was this: without reverence, you were nothing. The animals didn't come to arrogance, they came to respect. And survival in the Arctic wasn't about dominating nature, but persuading it, gently, constantly, desperately. But reverence alone doesn't pass on knowledge. You don't survive one lifetime in the Arctic by keeping secrets, which is why the next step wasn't just about killing or thanking. It was about teaching, passing the skills, stories, and rituals to the next generation before the ice swallowed you for good. So, you've poured water into the seal's mouth, whispered your thanks, and returned the bones to the sea like a polite dinner guest, leaving no mess behind. Good. Now the question is, who's watching you? Because if no one's watching, the knowledge dies with you. Out here, survival isn't an individual sport. It's a relay race where the baton is skill, and dropping it means the whole family starves. Forget classrooms, chalkboards, or motivational TED Talks. Knowledge here wasn't taught. It was absorbed, inhaled, etched into your muscles through repetition. A child's education started the second they could walk without face planting, and little hands dragged scraps of hide, played with miniature sleds, practiced tying knots until their fingers were raw. They didn't get toys shaped like animals. They got tools shaped like tools. A child's first harpoon wasn't cute. It was training wheels for death, and dinner rolled into one. And the teachers, everyone, grandparents told stories by the colic lamp, weaving hunting lessons into myths. Fathers and uncles dragged boys onto the ice, teaching them how to listen for a seal's breath without freezing their eardrums off. Mothers passed on the secrets of sewing waterproof seams with sinew, showing daughters how to stitch caribou hide so snow couldn't creep through. Even play was instruction. Children chased dogs not just for fun, but to learn their moods, their cues, their speed. Childhood wasn't about wasting time. Childhood was a boot camp disguised as life. And the medium of education wasn't just action, but story. Myths of Sedna weren't bedtime tales. They were ecological lectures about respecting the sea. Trickster stories taught flexibility and problem solving. Legends of hunters lost to arrogance were cautionary syllabi. You didn't learn by being scolded. You learned by laughing, shivering, and feeling the chill of mortality through narrative. It stuck better than any lecture. The transmission was relentless, because time was merciless. A missed lesson could mean fumbling a knot in a storm, or misreading ice that cracked beneath you. One mistake erased decades of careful survival, so knowledge wasn't optional. It was the air you breathed, passed down with the urgency of people who knew they didn't have room for error. Picture yourself as a child in this world. You're crouched by your grandfather, who's scraping a seal hide. His hands move with a rhythm you barely comprehend, but he talks while he works, voice low, telling you how the spirits see waste, how to test ice, how to tie a line so it doesn't snap when your life is hanging from it. You're half listening, half drifting into the firelight, but the lesson sinks in. Later, you'll find yourself mimicking his movements, without realizing you've memorized them. That's how it works. Not exams, not certificates, just embodied memory. And by the time you're old enough to hunt alone, you carry an encyclopedia in your bones. Not because you chose to, but because everyone made sure of it. Knowledge wasn't a luxury. It was inheritance, more precious than any pile of furs or carved amulets. Lose your tools, you could rebuild them. Lose your knowledge, you were already a corpse. So the skills stayed alive, moving from hand to hand, generation to generation, stitched as tightly as the seams of a sealskin parka. And when the knowledge finally produced results, a successful hunt, a warm parka, a shared feast, it didn't belong to you. It belonged to everyone. Because in the Arctic, survival wasn't individual genius. It was community, knitted together through lessons and sharing. Which leads us naturally to the next, equally inescapable truth. The hunt wasn't really yours at all. What you caught, what you killed, what you stitched, it didn't belong to you. It belonged to the community. And survival meant learning to share, whether you liked it or not. So, you've mastered the knots, read the ice, speared the seal, stitched the parka. Impressive. But don't think for a second that seal is yours, or the parka, or the whale, or the caribou, or even the fish you froze your eyelashes to catch. Out here, ownership is a joke, and the punchline is, everything you bring home goes straight into other people's mouths. Welcome to community survival, where selfishness is not just frowned upon, but actively lethal. Imagine dragging a seal back to camp, your arms numb, your belly screaming, and before you've even set it down, people are gathering elders, cousins, widows, children, neighbors. Nobody asks, is this yours? Because the answer is obvious. No, it's ours. Inuit hunting was never about individual victory. It was about collective insurance. If one family ate while another starved, the imbalance threatened everyone. A hungry neighbor might become a desperate thief. A desperate thief might destabilize the whole camp. So the solution was simple. Sharing wasn't kindness, it was policy. The rules were ancient, strict, and oddly bureaucratic. Seal meat got divided in particular ways, certain cuts reserved for elders or families in need. Whale hunts followed distribution patterns like tax codes, except the accountant was the memory of the community. Everyone knew who got what, and to hoard was to invite shame so deep it could outlast generations. Nobody wanted to be remembered as the one who kept the blubber. And here's the irony. In a landscape that could kill you in minutes, the real danger wasn't the cold, it was greed. One selfish hunter could unravel decades of trust, turn survival into suspicion. Sharing wasn't generosity, it was survival technology, as important as the harpoon or the sled. Picture yourself in camp as a whale carcass is butchered. Strips of blubber are piled, meat cut into slabs, sinew bundled. The atmosphere isn't celebratory gluttony, it's careful distribution. Elders' homes receive portions first, widows and orphans next. Families with hunters who risked most take their share. Even the dogs, foaming and howling, receive their due. And when it's all divided, you don't stand smug over your plate. You eat knowing everyone else eats too, and that if tomorrow you return empty-handed, you'll still be fed. And let's be clear, this didn't mean everyone was saintly. People noticed who gave and who took. Generosity was social capital, stinginess a curse. The camp remembered. They remembered who shared the last strip of dried fish in a famine, and they remembered who pretended not to hear when the neighbor's children cried from hunger. Memory was sharper than ice, and it cut deep. This system of sharing made survival more than physical. It made it cultural. Every hunt echoed across the community, binding people together with obligation, gratitude, and mutual dependence. You weren't a hunter for yourself. You were a hunter for the group, and the group, in turn, was your safety net. So imagine yourself biting into seal meat after days of hunger. You savor it, yes, but you also glance around, watching others eat. Relief spreads not just through your stomach, but through the entire camp. Survival tastes better when it's collective. But collective survival wasn't just about bodies fed and clothed. It was also about balance, not just social, but cosmic. Because even if everyone shared perfectly, none of it mattered if the spirits of the land and sea decided to close their hands. And that meant living in a constant cycle of adaptation, of honoring the old ways, while adjusting to new realities. So, you've shared your seal, divided your whale, passed your caribou sinew around like a communal sewing kit. Everyone's fed, everyone's clothed, and for a fleeting second you think, maybe survival's under control. But here's the twist. The Arctic laughs at control. Seasons shift, herds change course, ice patterns flip, outsiders arrive with rifles and ships. The only thing permanent is adaptation. Survival wasn't just about hunting, it was about adjusting the hunt, endlessly, to a world that kept rewriting its own rules. Think about it. The first Europeans to wander north marveled at Inuit efficiency, then immediately tried to replace it with trade goods. Rifles, steel, and motorboats entered the scene, and yes, they made some things faster. A bullet dropped a seal more easily than a harpoon. A boat engine outpaced paddles. But technology didn't erase the need for knowledge. A rifle was useless if you didn't know where seals surfaced. A motorboat still flipped if you couldn't read ice or weather. Outsiders brought tools. Inuit kept the wisdom that made those tools matter. And adaptation wasn't new. Long before rifles, Inuit had adjusted constantly, shifting from harpoons to nets when fish ran thick, from sea hunts to inland caribou drives when the ice thinned. They read every change like a code. Animal behavior, ice dynamics, migration rhythms. If the cod vanished, they turned to char. If the caribou veered left this year, they rebuilt drive lines. Flexibility wasn't optional, it was law. The penalty for stubbornness was extinction. But here's the irony. What outsiders called primitive survival was in fact resilience far more sophisticated than anything they brought. Inuit didn't just hunt. They maintained a relationship with ecosystems, spirits, and seasons that kept them alive for millennia in conditions that would kill most people in a day. And that continuity survived rifles, survived colonization, survived missionaries tut-tutting about superstition. Even today, seals are still hunted, whales still harvested, caribou still pursued. The techniques may blend old and new, but the principle remains. Respect the land, adapt to its moods, use every part, and share. Picture yourself now in a modern Inuit community. A hunter sets out with a snowmobile instead of a sled, rifle instead of harpoon, but the knowledge guiding him is ancient. He still knows the seal holes, the migration times, the ice cracks. He still pours water into a seal's mouth, still divides the catch with neighbors, still tells stories by lamplight that teach children to watch, listen, and respect. Continuity disguised as change. The tools evolve, the ethic remains, and that ethic is what carried Inuit survival into the present. The Arctic never got easier. Temperatures still drop to cruel numbers. Storms still blot out horizons. Animals still disappear without warning. But Inuit ways of hunting, flexible, reverent, communal, proved more durable than anything frozen into ice. Outsiders came and went. The people who adapted, who kept the line unbroken between past and present, stayed. So yes, if you had been born into this world, you wouldn't just have learned to hunt seals, whales, fish, and caribou. You'd have learned how to bend with the Arctic, how to survive by shifting, sharing, and respecting. Because the real secret of Inuit hunting wasn't killing animals. It was continuity, the quiet, relentless thread of knowledge that made sure one generation after another didn't disappear beneath the snow. And that's the part no outsider expedition ever quite understood. They arrived with guns and maps, froze to death anyway, and left their bones in the tundra. They adapted, they continued, they're still here. In the beginning, tools weren't tools. They were awkward extensions of bone and instinct, improvised shapes in desperate hands. A broken branch hardened in fire, a stone chipped against another, a strip of hide twisted into something vaguely useful. The useful each object was less about invention and more about avoiding an unceremonious death in the cold mud. Before names, before categories, survival hinged on flimsy flesh against an environment that had no patience for mistakes. The body alone was pitifully unarmed. Blunt teeth, slow legs, soft skin. Something had to bridge that fragile gap between hunger and endurance. And so the first sacred alliances were struck not with gods carved in temples, but with dogs, spears, and kayaks. They weren't merely objects. They were prosthetics of existence. A spear wasn't a stick with a sharpened end. It was reach itself, lengthened arm and sharpened will. A dog wasn't just an animal that followed firelight. It was warmth, vigilance, and loyalty bound into a body that could smell danger hours before human senses caught up. And a kayak was never simply a floating shelled. It was the thin skin between life and the swallowing dark of the sea. Long before theology, people understood holiness as anything that kept the blood flowing another day. This is why those tools slipped so easily into myth. They weren't background props. They were characters in the same story, sometimes the only reason the story kept going. Cultures that lived with dogs, that carried spears, that rode the water in fragile kayaks, folded them into their cosmologies without hesitation. Sacred wasn't some mystical label granted later by priests, it was the wordless awe of realizing that without these companions, hunger, predators, or the ocean would win. And in a world where every dawn was an open wager with death, winning mattered. Dogs in particular took on roles no one else could. They ran between the fire and the forest, between the warmth of the camp and the teeth of the wilderness. They crossed boundaries effortlessly, living as much in the shadows as in the hearth. When humans began to bury their dead, dogs often followed into the soil, sometimes sacrificed, sometimes laid gently beside their masters, as if to keep guiding them past the last horizon. The fact that people gave dogs the same passage rights as kin says more than any carved idol ever could. They weren't just animals. They were escorts across borders that had no return. They padded quietly at the edge of the fire, shadows with glowing eyes, half tame, half wild. Dogs were never fully on one side or the other. They lingered between the forest and the camp, knowing exactly when to step closer and when to vanish into the dark. In the Ice Age, they weren't pets curled lazily on sofas. They were sentinels, heaters, hunters, and alarm bells with teeth. A pup born into a camp meant more than another mouth to feed it. Was an extra pair of ears against the night, a moving furnace under a fur blanket. And sometimes, the only reason the children made it through winter. It's telling that dogs appear again and again at the very edges of myth. Among the Greeks, Cerberus stood at the gates of the underworld. Among the Norse, Garma waited in chains until the world broke open. Across the Americas and Siberia, dogs were ferrymen of souls, slipping naturally into the role of guides between life and death. They didn't earn this place because of poetic imagination, they earned it because, in the real world, they were already escorts across danger. They led hunters to prey, they pulled sleds through landscapes humans alone could not conquer. And when wolves prowled near the tents, dogs were the first to raise their throats. The intimacy was physical. People slept pressed against dogs, relying on their heat as much as on their warning growls. Imagine a night on the steppe. No wood left for the fire, snow piling against the hide walls. A dog was the difference between waking stiff and waking frozen. Anthropologists have found burials where dogs lay curled beside their humans, as if death itself couldn't sever the partnership. Others were placed deliberately in graves as companions for the journey, practical, even in the afterlife. If death was a wilderness, who better to trust than the one who'd always smelled trouble before it arrived? And there were other roles, less gentle. Dogs were also sacrificed. In many societies, their throats were cut as offerings to ensure luck in the hunt, or safe passage across the river of the dead. The logic was cruel, but consistent. If dogs could guide the living, surely they could carry messages to the unseen. Their value wasn't only in life, it lingered in ritual death as well. And so a strange duality formed. Dogs as beloved kin, and dogs as expendable currency. Sometimes mourned, sometimes eaten, sometimes both. From firelight and burial pits, the story winds naturally toward how value was measured, not only in lives, but in the sharp line between hunger and survival. That's where spears entered, silent and lethal, shaping the ritual of the kill. A dog wasn't just a companion, it was a kind of currency, a living coin with fur and breath. In many hunter-gatherer societies, trading dogs was no different from exchanging tools or cloth. A strong, trained animal could be swapped for food, hides, even wives. Among the Inuit, a sled team was wealth incarnate, the difference between reaching a distant hunting ground or being stranded in drifts. To own many dogs was to own distance itself, to stretch one's reach across frozen horizons. But wealth always walks hand in hand with sacrifice. Dogs were buried with warriors, not only as companions, but as payment insurance that the dead man's soul wouldn't wander lost. Some Siberian graves show dogs positioned carefully at the feet, like guardians waiting to rise. Elsewhere, entire packs were slaughtered during funerals of chiefs, their deaths meant to echo the authority of the man who once commanded them. To us it feels grotesque, but to them, power was never buried alone. It dragged its symbols, its flesh, its loyalty into the earth. And then there was the inversion, the unspeakable necessity, eating dogs. In times of famine, when the sea withheld fish and the reindeer herds vanished, the firelight turned upon the very animals that had once protected it. Among the Aztecs, dog meat was ritually consumed, sometimes as sacrifice, sometimes as delicacy. In the Arctic, hunger made no exceptions. The same paws that pulled sleds by day might become broth by night. It wasn't betrayal. It was acknowledgement of the dog's ultimate role in survival. Their bodies could sustain in death just as their loyalty had sustained in life. This strange oscillation, beloved kin, sacred guide, expendable offering, etched dogs deeply into human imagination. They became symbols of liminality, forever standing on the threshold, alive and dead, family and food, protector and sacrifice. And it's from this same edge of necessity that another tool emerged, colder, harder, and less forgiving: the spear, the line between hunger and emptiness. The spear was blunt honesty, carved into wood and stone. Unlike dogs, with their wagging warmth and eerie devotion, spears offered nothing but distance between flesh and claw, between hunger and meat, between a fragile human body and the thing it needed to kill. A sharpened point, lashed to a shaft, transformed frailty into reach. Suddenly, an arm could stretch across the body length of a charging boar. Suddenly, death could be delivered before jaws ever met skin. Archaeologists have pulled spears from peat bogs and riverbeds, some over 300,000 years old, whittled from spruce or pine and balanced so precisely they might still fly straight. These weren't clumsy improvisations. They were the results of obsessive care, carved smooth, and weighted for survival. To hold one was to hold not just a stick, but centuries of inherited instinct, the rhythm of throwing, the sound of the point striking bone, the knowledge that you either feasted tonight or watched your children starve. It's no wonder then that spears blurred into ritual. Among the Maasai of East Africa, a youth became a warrior only after facing a lion with a spy, an ordeal that stamped blood into identity. In Europe's Bronze Age, spears were often bent and buried with their owners, deliberately killed so their spirit might travel with the dead. Across the Arctic, Inuit hunters carried ivory-tipped harpoons, not only as tools but as instruments bound to song. Charms whispered into the weapon before thrusting it toward seal or whale. A spear was never neutral, it carried intention like a second edge, and it also carried memory. The first time a boy's spear tasted blood marked him forever. A shift from child to adult, written not in ink, but in tendon and trembling hands. The weapon was more than wood, and stone it was a witness, a participant in his transformation. Some spears were kept for generations, their points reshaped, their shafts rebound, each cut and stain layering stories. A man without a spear was incomplete. A spear without a man was restless. This intimacy between object and body made every hunt a kind of theater, a performance staged not only for meat but for ancestors, for spirits believed to watch from tree, sky, or sea. Killing wasn't just necessity, it was demonstration, a ritual of precision and courage. And with every strike, the question lingered, was the spear carrying the man, or was the man carrying the spear? From there, it's only natural to slip into the deeper ritual of the kill itself, where a spear was never just a tool, it was an initiation, a litmus test of maturity, and the stage on which blood became meaning. Every culture that relied on spears eventually turned killing into ritual. The act itself was too charged to remain only about calories and hides. It became theater, trial, initiation. A boy holding his first spear was not simply aiming for meat, he was aiming for recognition, for passage into the uncertain fraternity of adulthood. The first kill was rarely private. It unfolded under the watch of elders, each thrust not just against the animal but against doubt, fear, and the possibility of shame. Among the Ache of Paraguay, young hunters were tested by their ability to bring down large game, their first successful strike binding them to manhood. In Arctic communities, boys joined whale hunts, not only to learn technique, but to confront the enormity of life and death in a single heaving body of flesh. Even in ancient Europe, evidence suggests hunting was bound into ceremony, with spears decorated, songs recited, and kills ritually divided to ensure no one forgot the larger order beyond appetite. The ritual of the kill wasn't improvisation, it was choreography, rehearsed across centuries. Blood-marked thresholds. The moment a spear drew first blood was heavy with meaning. The boy now standing with 1 foot in childhood and 1 foot in a lineage of hunters stretching behind him. The animal was not only prey, it was a witness, a reluctant officiant at the rite of passage. This is why so many traditions demanded apology or tribute to the spirit of the slain. In parts of Siberia, hunters whispered to the bear they had just killed, asking forgiveness. In the Pacific Northwest, salmon were returned to the river with ceremony, their spirits honored to ensure the run continued. The spear punctured more than flesh. It punctured the thin line between human hunger and cosmic balance. That balance extended beyond the living. Spears were often interred with their owners, bent or broken so they might guard the soul on its passage. The logic was consistent. If a spear had carried a man through danger in life, it could just as easily carry him through death. To die without one was to risk entering the other world unarmed, defenseless against whatever lurked there. The spear was never truly left behind. It was an inseparable companion. Its wooden shaft a spine, its point an echo of the teeth and claws humans lacked but desperately needed. And yet, for all its weight and ritual, the spear remained a tool tied firmly to the land. The hunt unfolded on soil, among trees, across plains. It was only when people turned their gaze to water endless, cold, and devouring that another sacred object emerged, this time stitched from hide and bone. The kayak, fragile shell against infinite sea. The kayak was a skin stretched over emptiness, a stitched ghost of animals turned into a vessel. In Arctic communities, seals gave their hides, driftwood their skeletons, and human hands their patience, binding the two into a boat, light enough to lift with one arm, yet strong enough to dance with the sea. To call it a tool is to thin it, was a second body, an exoskeleton that allowed a person to slip across water like a shadow. Without it, the ocean remained an unbroken wall. With it, the horizon opened, promising both sustenance and sudden drowning. The fragility was part of its power. Unlike great ships, kayaks admitted no excess, no passengers, no unnecessary weight. One body, one vessel, one fate. The hunter sealed inside became inseparable from the craft, his legs locked beneath deck, his torso emerging like a second mast. The balance was so precarious that a wrong twitch meant capsizing into water cold enough to stop the heart before a prayer could form. And yet, people trusted these fragile skins to carry them after whales, across fjords, into storms that bent trees to the ground. Faith in the kayak was not naive, it was the only kind of faith the sea respected. Crafting one was a ritual as much as an engineering feat. Women prepared the hides, softening, stretching, and sewing them with bone needles so precise that seams barely leaked. Men carved driftwood frames, measuring proportions by body parts, an arm span here, a fingertip there. When finished, the kayak wasn't simply launched. Tift was often blessed, tested, sung to. In Greenland, kayaks were sometimes painted or marked, each with its own personality, as though it were a living being joining the community. To mistreat it was sacrilege. To neglect it was courting death. Inside, the hunter carried not only himself but his entire world in miniature spear, line, harpoon, dog lashings, sometimes tied to the stern. The kayak became a cosmos of survival. Every piece placed within reach because fumbling meant disaster. At sea, there was no pause, no second chance. A kayak demanded perfection the way the ocean demanded tribute. And because the ocean was never just a backdrop, was a god with teeth, always hungry, always listening. Which meant the kayak was more than transport. It was an offering, a wager made in bone and skin, launched daily onto a surface that could decide, at any moment, to take everything back. The ocean was never neutral. It was a devourer, a shifting mouth that swallowed men, dogs, and boats alike, without distinction. To those who lived beside it, the sea wasn't scenery, it was a god with teeth, moody and insatiable, and the kayak was the only bargaining chip placed on its altar. Setting out wasn't transportation, it was ritualized negotiation. Each launch was a gamble, flesh wrapped in skin, daring to skim the edge of a force that could drown villages in an afternoon. People knew this well, which is why kayaks were treated as more than wood and hide. They were dressed, blessed, even offered songs. Some Inuit hunters would stroke their kayaks before a voyage, whispering charms to keep the waters calm. In Greenland, a capsized kayak wasn't always recovered. Sometimes it was left drifting, surrendered as payment to the ocean's hunger. Other times, kayaks were deliberately sunk at the end of a hunter's life, as if releasing the vessel back to the abyss it had so often defied. The ocean's duality provider and predator forced reverence into every gesture. Harpoons were tipped with ivory charms, not because ivory made them stronger, but because ivory carried whispers of power. Storms weren't accidents. They were moods of the sea god, punishments for arrogance or neglect. A man who failed to honor taboos perhaps, who mocked an animal, or wasted its meat might find his kayak suddenly unsteady, the water conspiring to roll him under. To outsiders, superstition. To those who lived it, observable truth. And yet, people returned again and again. Hunger left no alternative. Whales and seals were the lifeblood of Arctic life, and the only way to reach them was to place one's faith in fragile hides stretched over bone. Survival demanded intimacy with terror, and the kayak was the mediator, the fragile skin between human will and oceanic appetite. To disrespect it was to invite erasure. Still, this reverence didn't exist in isolation. The kayak was one piece of a triad, bound with the spear in the dog, each tool sacred in its domain land, hand, and set together forming the framework that made survival possible. Land, water, and the fragile flesh stretched between them. This was the theater in which dogs, spears, and kayaks played their parts. Each tool was sacred because each governed a separate frontier. On land, dogs gave speed, heat, and vigilance. In the hand, spears extended reach and carved mortality into prey. On the water, kayaks carried the body into a realm that otherwise devoured it. Together, they formed a trinity of endurance, a tripod holding up the precarious weight of survival. Remove one, and the structure faltered. The symmetry is almost poetic. Dogs made the ground navigable, warning of predators, sniffing out trails, pulling loads over snow. Spears turned hunger into meat, bridged the gap between fragility and ferocity. Kayaks opened the sea, that endless horizon of hunger and risk, and gave it edges humans could traverse. Each was an extension of the body: paws for legs, sharpened wood for arms, stitched hide for skin. Technology in its earliest, most intimate form, tools not as objects, but as prosthetics of existence. And because they were so essential, they weren't treated casually. Dogs were named and mourned. Spears were inherited, repaired, and buried. Kayaks were tested, honored, and sometimes destroyed in ritual surrender. The sacredness wasn't ornamental. It was carved by necessity. To honor them was to recognize their role in holding chaos at bay. Anthropologists sometimes describe these tools as ecological adaptations, which is tidy language for what was, in truth, a matter of life or erasure. Every howl in the night, every spear thrust, every creak of hide against water was a reminder that survival was stitched together from borrowed parts. Without dogs, humans were deaf and slow. Without spears, they were toothless. Without kayaks, they were landlocked. And in recognizing these tools as more than objects, cultures began to treat them as kin tools that could inherit memory, carry names, and bear responsibility. They stopped being mere instruments and started to become ancestors themselves. Tools don't usually get funerals, yet spears were buried, kayaks were sunk, and dogs were laid into graves with as much care as children. This wasn't sentimentality, it was recognition that tools carried pieces of their owners. A spear passed from father to son wasn't just sharpened wood. It bore the weight of hunts, survived, animals struck, nights endured. A kayak patched again and again, its frame darkened with oil and salt, was less an object than a biography sealed in driftwood. Even dogs, bred into lineages, carried names that linked them to ancestors, each bark echoing the continuity of families. This inheritance turned tools into kin. They were named, not numbered. Among Arctic hunters, kayaks often had personal titles, whispered into storms, as if calling out to a stubborn friend. Spears, too, bore nicknames, some etched with markings that transformed them into characters in the hunt. In Japan, though far from the Arctic, swords were treated with similar reverence, polished, enshrined, even feared as if they housed their own souls. The pattern repeats wherever survival depended on a sliver of sharpened material, the line between thing and being blurred. And when death came, the tools followed. Spears were killed, bent deliberately so their spirits could join the owner. Kayaks were sometimes burned or cast adrift, carrying the memory of the man who once sat inside, his shape still implicit in the empty frame. Dogs, sacrificed or carefully laid in the earth, padded forward as escorts, guiding the soul along trails invisible to human eyes. In this way, the tools didn't just survive their owners, they escorted them, just as faithfully in death as in life. To treat tools as ancestors was to admit dependence. It was to recognize that survival was never accomplished alone. It was achieved through alliances with wood, hide, bone, and paw. And once that admission was made, it was only a short step to ritualize those bonds into myths, ceremonies, and cosmologies. Tools became ancestors because they had always been guardians. Even now, the echoes linger. Modernity stripped away the sacred, filing dogs under pets, spears under weapons, and kayaks under gear. Yet the haunting truth remains. Without them, there would be no modernity at all. Today, the Trinity survives, though disguised. Dogs curl at the foot of beds, their paws twitching in dream, as if still running across snowfields. Spears lean behind glass in museums, mute and polished, stripped of the blood and trembling hands that once gave them meaning. Kayaks glide in summer lakes, fluorescent plastic shells carrying weekend hobbyists who rarely imagine that the shape beneath them was once the only skin-thin barrier between hunter and abyss. It's tempting to see these objects as diminished pets, relics, toys, but the old echoes are stubborn. The bond with dogs hasn't loosened, it's simply softened. They're still guardians, still healers in disguise, still companions that humans trust with secrets no other ears deserve. Spears may no longer test manhood, but they remain ceremonial, paraded by tribes, raised in military insignia, evoked whenever humans want to remember the raw simplicity of thrust and defense. And kayaks, even in their modern polyethylene form, retain that fragility. Capsize one in icy water, and the truth returns instantly. The sea is still hungry, and the boat is still your only skin. Strip away the myths, and the sacredness persists in quiet ways. People still name their dogs, still pass down heirlooms with the reverence of lineage, still treat vessels with a kind of affection that belies their inanimacy. Anthropologists call this animism, but really it's just memory, the body remembering what it once owed to paw, to point, to frame. The irony is that modernity laughs at the sacred while quietly depending on it. Planes, phones, satellites, these are just newer skins stretched over emptiness, newer spears hurled further, newer dogs sniffing danger in algorithms. The form changed, but the principle didn't. Survival is always outsourced to tools, and those tools always creep into myth, whether anyone admits it or not. And so, dogs, spears and kayaks linger at the edge of our imagination, less visible perhaps, but still haunting, reminders that sacredness was never about temples or altars. It was about whatever kept the blood flowing, whatever turned fragile skin into something that could outlast the night. The moment an animal hit the ground, the silence of the hunt cracked open into noise. Blood steaming in the cold, dust clinging to its hide. The carcass became less an animal and more a riddle. What now? The hunter's muscles might still tremble from the chase, but there was no time for triumph. The kill was never his alone. In most foraging societies, success carried a hidden weight, the obligation to divide. The bigger the beast, the heavier the politics. One antelope meant several families had to be fed. A buffalo meant the entire camp was watching. It's a peculiar irony. Meat, the ultimate prize, also became the ultimate problem. Fresh carcasses spoiled quickly, and everyone knew it. The hunter couldn't drag it into his hut and gnaw in secret. Eyes would follow, voices would whisper, and soon enough, resentment would grow sharper than flint blades. Hoarding was dangerous, not just because it was selfish, but because it made you look suspiciously like someone trying to live above the group. That never ended well. If fire kept predators at bay, sharing kept neighbors from turning into predators themselves. Anthropologists studying the Hadza or the Roo Honzi note this strange paradox. Hunters who struck big game were often the last to boast about it. In fact, bragging was punished with laughter, teasing, and a kind of public ridicule designed to keep egos small. A man might spend all day stalking a kudu, drag it home with his shoulders torn raw, only to have the others chuckle and say, "That scrawny thing, we'll barely taste it." It wasn't cruelty, it was insurance. By making the successful appear humble, the group ensured meat didn't turn into monarchy. Still, everyone knew that reputation lived or died at the butcher's pile. A man who consistently shared would never lack support when illness struck or tools broke. A man who withheld could watch his children grow thinner, not because others hated them, but because alliances had quietly shifted. The animal, already dead, still had the power to choose who survived the season. And survival wasn't just a matter of cutting chunks and tossing them around. It slid into ritual, into hierarchy, into subtle games of who received which slice first. That's where meat became something else entirely. Less dinner, more currency. A slab of meat was never just a slab of meat. Once hacked free from sinew and bone, it transformed into something closer to coinage. The kind of tender that didn't fit in a pouch but carried value all the same. Its worth wasn't measured in calories alone, though those mattered, especially in lean months, but in what it bought: loyalty, prestige, and the quiet assurance that when misfortune circled back, someone would remember. Among the Inuit, the hunter who landed a seal didn't simply feed his household. The blubber, rich and thick, became an investment in social credit. Those who received portions could be called upon later to return the favor, a kind of cold-weather bank account. Only the interest was human lives. In East Africa, the hunter who shared zebra or buffalo meat effectively cemented his standing, not because others were too hungry to refuse, but because they saw in him a reliable partner, a man who understood that survival was always collective. Of course, this form of wealth rotted quickly. Meat didn't last, which made it the opposite of hoarded gold. You couldn't stash it in a cave and wait. You had to circulate it, keep it moving, let its value spill out across the group before flies and stench made it useless. And in that fleeting window, reputations were minted. To share generously was to print your face on the coins of memory. To clutch selfishly was to find yourself bankrupt the next time illness, hunger, or misfortune came clawing. It's no wonder that hunters who failed to share were treated with suspicion, even contempt. They were the equivalent of someone today hoarding bread in a famine, not because others would starve instantly, but because the gesture announced a dangerous philosophy, that one life could matter more than many. Sharing wasn't charity. It was insurance against the sharp edge of resentment. But not all systems treated meat the same way. Some camps leaned toward radical equality, while others let hierarchy creep in through the cuts. Who ate first, and who got the prized portions, wasn't a random choice. It revealed exactly how power sat inside the circle. The carcass on the ground was like a mirror. How it got divided reflected the soul of the group. Some societies practiced what could only be called militant equality. Among the Ruhonzi, for instance, the rule was simple. The hunter didn't own the meat, the group did. The moment the animal fell, the claim shifted to everyone present. Even the weapon mattered. If a hunter used someone else's poisoned arrow, the meat technically belonged to the arrow's owner, who then became responsible for dividing it fairly. The system made it impossible for one man to grow fat in status, while others grew thin in body. But not everywhere embraced this kind of radical flattening. In parts of Papua New Guinea, the kill flowed upward. Chiefs, shamans, or ritual specialists often controlled the distribution, handing out chunks as a show of authority. They weren't necessarily keeping the best bits for themselves, though that certainly happened, but they used the act of division as proof that power ran through their hands. To receive meat from a leader wasn't just sustenance, it was a reminder of dependence, a quiet lesson in who decided the rules of survival. Hierarchy often snuck in through subtler channels. In some groups, the head and heart were set aside for elders or ritual figures. The young men, no matter how hungry, might wait until the sacred cuts had passed through hands older and wiser. It wasn't about nutrition, it was about symbolism, a way of saying, your body runs on flesh, but your place in society runs on respect. The irony is that both systems, the egalitarian and the hierarchical, solved the same problem: how to stop meat from tearing a community apart. Either you cut the animal so evenly no one could complain, or you placed the knife in the hands of someone too important to argue with. What you didn't do, unless you had a death wish, was hoard. And so the ritual of sharing kept rolling, always with an eye on order. The next question, though, was order of mouths. Who, exactly, got to eat first? Around the fire, priority wasn't just about appetite, it was choreography, a slow dance of authority, deference, and survival. In many hunter-gatherer bands, the rule was straightforward. The oldest ate first. Not because wrinkles deserved reverence on their own, but because those wrinkles carried memory. Keeping the elders fed meant keeping the oral library alive. The people who remembered waterholes in drought, years, or the right plants for a cough. Losing them was like burning the only archive. But in other places, the first bite belonged to the children. Fragile bodies were triogged ahead of strong hunters. Anthropologists have noted this among certain Arctic groups. Kids got the choicest fatty cuts, the ones that ensured brains grew and bones didn't splinter in the cold. Adults could tighten belts, the future couldn't. A paradox again. The ones who hunted hardest often ate last. And then there were the ritual specialists, those slightly unsettling figures who could turn a meal into a negotiation with the unseen. Shamans, priests, or spirit talkers were sometimes fed first, not because they needed the protein, but because feeding them meant feeding whatever they were in contact with. If the ancestors were expected to keep the camp safe, they too had to be served, by proxy, through the mouth of their chosen human. A greasy bite swallowed in silence could carry the weight of cosmic insurance. The question of who ate first wasn't trivial. A misstep could fester into resentment, and resentment had a way of turning lean winters lethal. A hunter who elbowed his way into the front of the line might find his next kill met with cold stares, or worse, suspicious accidents in the bush. Meat was nourishment, but the sequence of eating was politics, and politics decided survival just as much as calories. And of course, none of this happened randomly. The rules of order were carved right into the body of the animal itself, in how it was cut, portioned, and laid out, every incision a signpost pointing toward the deeper structure of the group. A carcass was never just hacked apart like firewood. The cutting itself was a performance, and everyone watched. The hands holding the knife weren't only dividing flesh, they were dividing meaning. Among many groups, butchering followed strict sequences. Start with the ribs, move to the haunches, finish with the head. Deviate from the order, and you weren't just clumsy, you were suspicious. Maybe even disrespectful to the animal's spirit. The tools mattered, too. In Ice Age Europe, flint blades left marks still visible on fossilized bones, evidence of careful, practiced strokes. In East Africa, obsidian shards sliced with surgical precision, proving that butchering was as much an art as a necessity. The neatness of the cuts wasn't about aesthetics. It signaled competence, and competence was trust. A butcher who wasted meat through sloppy cuts could find himself excluded the next time, no matter how sharp his spear in the hunt. Symbolism seeped into the sequence. Some parts of the animal carried heavier weight than others. The liver, often seen as a seat of vitality, might be set aside for ritual leaders. The heart might go to elders, the marrow to children. Every allocation carried layers of unspoken messages about who was valued, who was protected, and who was expendable. Even in groups priding themselves on equality, someone had to stand with the knife, and that person's hands effectively became the axis of justice. Sharing was the ideal, but the gesture of carving was power. To decide where to slice was to decide where relationships stood. A cut to generous here, a scrap to stingy there, all of it registered in the collective memory. By the time the meat was laid out, what remained wasn't just food, but a map of obligation. Every portion carried a subtle tag. This was given, this was withheld, this was owed. And once gifts were in circulation, they lingered, invisible, heavy, impossible to ignore. Once a strip of flesh left the butcher's hands, it didn't vanish into the fire or the mouth. It lingered. Every bite carried the faint taste of obligation, as if the meat itself remembered. Among the Inuit, a hunter who shared seal or whale wasn't just feeding others for the evening. He was binding them to him with invisible cords. Cords that could be tugged months later in the form of returned help, shelter, or food when his luck ran thin. Anthropologists working with the Ru, Honzi, describe how refusing to share could be a kind of social suicide. A hunter who kept too much for his own family quickly found himself isolated. His children might still chew on marrow, but neighbors' eyes grew colder, conversations shorter, alliances brittle. The group didn't need to punish him. The slow frost of exclusion did the job. In societies where every illness, every broken tool, every failed hunt demanded help from others, being cut off was worse than hunger. It was a death sentence delivered quietly. But this economy of gifts worked both ways. To accept a portion wasn't free. It created a debt, one that might come due in inconvenient times. The more you ate from another's generosity, the more your own hunts became less your own. Every spear thrust, every long chase across dust or snow, became part of the group's collective account book. To say no to a gift could be interpreted as arrogance, but to say yes meant opening your future to claims. Survival hinged on navigating that balance. This is why generosity was less about kindness and more about strategy. To share was to broadcast strength, not weakness. Only someone confident enough in their skills could afford to give freely, and those who gave the most often found themselves surrounded by allies who would remember when famine tested patience and trust. The logic seeped into more intimate realms as well. Meat didn't just decide who owed whom, it shaped who loved whom, who courted whom, and who seemed worth binding one's life to. The smell of roasted flesh could drift from the fire into the very architecture of marriage. A sharpened spear could win more than food. It could win a family. In many foraging societies, marriage wasn't arranged around poetry or moonlight, but around a man's capacity to provide. A hunter who returned again and again with meat wasn't simply admired. He was courted, sought out, whispered about near the fire. His generosity translated directly into desirability. To be known as the man who fed not only his kin but his neighbors was to be known as reliable. The kind of partner who could keep children alive through lean seasons. The Ru Honzi in southern Africa made this painfully clear. Young men eager for wives had to show not just their skill with a bow, but their willingness to distribute the spoils. A stingy hunter, no matter how accurate his arrows, struggled to find a partner. Women, practical as ever, knew that a selfish man might fill his own belly but let others, including his future children, starve. Better the hunter mocked for scrawny kills, but trusted to share than the swaggering loner devouring his own kudu in secret. Even in more hierarchical systems, the connection between meat and marriage held firm. In some Arctic groups, successful hunters could support multiple wives, their household expanding in proportion to the seals and whales they hauled from the ice. Status, affection, and reproductive success all converged on one skill: putting flesh on the fire and then portioning it outward. A romance without meat was no romance at all. At best, it was a fragile experiment doomed by hunger. What's striking is how long these reputations lingered. An old man might no longer hunt, but if people remembered him as once generous, his daughters and sons benefited. Marriage wasn't only about the present. It was about inherited echoes of how much a father gave away in the past. And inversely, the selfish left behind an aftertaste that soured generations. A hoarder's grandchildren might feel the chill of ancestors' miserliness long after the bones of the original animal had turned to dust. But sharing didn't always stop neatly at the boundaries of kinship. Strangers arrived, guests appeared, rival camps drew closer, and in those moments, the rules of meat sharing carried even heavier weight. For inclusion or exclusion at the feast could mean the difference between alliance and enmity. When strangers drifted into camp, the smell of roasting meat became more than sustenance. It was a test. To extend a portion was to signal openness, maybe even the start of an alliance. To deny it was to declare boundaries sharp as flint. Anthropologists have long noted how meat, far more than roots or berries, acted as a marker of inclusion. Grain could be traded, fish could be bartered, but the flesh of a freshly killed animal carried an intimacy. If you're chewing the same ribs, you're part of us, at least for tonight. Yet this invitation was never free of risk. In many Arctic camps, giving a cut of seal to visiting hunters could create obligations that lingered uncomfortably. Guests might later return, expecting more, their presence heavier than welcome. Hospitality was a gamble. Feed them, and you risk draining your stores. Deny them, and you risk enemies with long memories. Sharing was a kind of diplomacy, one negotiated in grease and bone. Sometimes the choice leaned toward paranoia. In famine years, outsiders arriving uninvited could find themselves fed scraps, or not at all. Archaeological evidence from Ice Age Europe shows butchery marks, suggesting animals were stripped down to marrow in hard times, leaving little to spare. In such conditions, a guest wasn't a curiosity, he was a threat with a mouth attached. The same fire that once welcomed could, under stress, turn hostile, its smoke rising over whispered suspicions. But when it worked, the outsider's share became a bridge. Among plains groups in North America, hunters often gave prized cuts to visiting allies, sealing friendships not with handshakes but with steaming meat. Eating together forged bonds more durable than words. A shared carcass could outlast treaties, outlast marriages, sometimes even outlast blood feuds. Still, the shadow of scarcity always hovered, because when meat was rare, generosity turned brittle, and the polite mask of sharing slipped into something sharper. That's when hunger exposed the raw truth. Survival wasn't about kindness, it was about whether rules bent or broke under pressure. When the herds thinned or the ice failed to crack, meat shifted from glue to blade. The very rules meant to bind people together strained under famine. Anthropologists studying famine accounts in hunter-gatherer and pastoral societies noticed a grim pattern. Sharing contracts tightened, exceptions were carved, and the circle of generosity shrank inward to bloodkin. Those once included at the fire now found themselves outside the glow, watching from the dark as others chewed. Scarcity turned generosity into accusation. A hunter who once boasted of giving freely suddenly became suspect if his cuts looked too thin or too selective. Was he cheating, holding back, favoring his own? In times of plenty, such whispers might have been shrugged off. In hunger, they could ignite violence. Among Arctic groups, there are accounts of disputes escalating to bloodshed when accusations of meat hoarding surfaced. It wasn't greed that caused death, but the perception of unfairness in an environment where unfairness meant extinction. Evidence of this tension runs deep in the archaeological record. Sites in Pleistocene Europe show bones cracked not once but twice, first to strip flesh, then again to leach every ounce of marrow. Sometimes even the skulls of dogs and wolves were split, suggesting nothing was spared. In such worlds, a family's survival might hinge on whether a neighbor offered marrow scraps or withheld them. Sharing was no longer optional. It was triage, and sometimes violence came not from withholding but from desperate taking. Raids for meat weren't just warfare. They were a last, brutal recalibration of who deserved to eat. A camp that failed to defend its carcasses might not survive the winter. Cannibalism, uncomfortable as it is to acknowledge, lurks in some of these records too. A final, terrible logic when no other meat remained. What's striking is how these collapses didn't erase the importance of sharing. They sharpened it. When famine lifted, rules were rebuilt, often stricter, more formal, as if people were trying to guard against memory itself. Yet bones remember better than laws. Cut marks and hearths still whisper that in hunger's grip, meat could decide not just who lived, but who killed. And long after the arguments faded, what endured were the traces etched on bone, scattered in ash, a silent record of how survival depended on the politics of flesh.